Long before Watson Sr. was consumed by worries about his sons, his legacy, and the future of his railroad empire, long before he was Mr. Watson, sir, if you please, Mr. Watson Sr., sir, if you please, he was nothing, maybe even less than nothing. After escaping the brutal circumstances of his youth, he rode the rails as a nameless cutthroat, a dangerous shadow who robbed and killed anyone he pleased. In those days, no one knew him, and he knew no one. Within a year of abandoning his old life, his real name was lost. It was years before he felt the need to assume a new one. Hunched in corners of empty boxcars, he would wait in the shadows, looking to take advantage of anyone unlucky enough to come aboard. Watson Sr. never spoke. He could barely form words from the stapled down corners of his mutilated mouth. Without language or companions, he survived as a lone predator. He was like a bear, huge, powerful, insensible to language, ferocious, and merciless with his victims. When Watson Sr. killed, he really liked to tear his victims apart. Just like a bear, he preferred to leave his victims torn open and gutless. But while a bear destroys its victims by instinct, for Watson Sr. it was due and proper for anyone who became a problem for him. His pure, bright onyx eyes could take the measure of a man in a moment, sizing up any situation for threat or intent, as if instinct favored him better as an animal than as a man. Watson Sr. had a terrible and violent temper. His young life was defined by the application of continual trauma. By the time he was 13, Watson Sr. could count more broken bones than birthdays. From an early age, a cruel hatred boiled inside him like black tar bubbling over the sides of an iron cauldron. His hatred was precious to him. It kept him alive when nothing else had. It had won the battle over sucking hopelessness and despair and allowed him to escape. When Watson Sr. was finally free to act on all the violent and wicked thoughts that had bloated in his mind for so long, effectively choking off any other thoughts, he gloried in the blood like it was a baptism by fire. Seeing the same fear that had swallowed his entire childhood fill someone else's eyes was a revelation to him, and he could not get enough of it. It did not take him long to evolve from a clumsy killer to a murderous beast. Empty rail cars were an exceptional habitat for a murderer to evolve. Watson Sr. quickly learned that the endless clickety-clack of rail joints under heavy steel wheels could silence any screams, no matter how agonized. With nothing to stop him, Watson Sr. took his killing instincts even further as he tried to avenge the traumas he had endured. It did not matter that the drifters and hobos who became his victims had never done anything to him. For Watson Sr., they were acceptable substitutes for the men whose faces loomed so large and hateful in his memory. He felt that the intensity of his hatred could only be bathed in blood and cured in fire. Watson Sr. began to establish a pattern and routine that seemed to satiate the rage, but still kept him safe from being caught. First, he would use his long Arkansas toothpick to arrest his victims while they slept by cutting their Achilles tendons. The startled victims would awaken screaming, their bodies ponderous and useless with pain. That is when the real nightmare would begin. Those doomed men would only ever see a large, dark figure whose face was hidden behind a kerchief, but whose black eyes glittered with awful intent. For years, Watson Sr. killed in this mutilating fashion, pulling his victims apart, cavorting like a bear with emptied shells of bodies and fast-moving train cars, hidden in the night and festooned with gore and entrails. In those days, Watson Sr. was little more than an animal. He lived by instinct, stealth, cunning, and little else. He was consumed by murder, and the purer depths of his soul only showed in occasional and grotesque displays of sorrow. Then there were the times, many, many times, when he was almost caught. But all the nights he had spent tied beneath a bed as a child, trying to grasp sleep amid clanging pots, moaning clamor, and shouted confusion, had left him with a nearly preternatural ability to hear anything and everything. Mostly life lived on the rails suited him very well. He enjoyed the fresh air and changing scenery, which he had never had a chance to experience before. In his whole life, Watson Sr. had never felt like that he had any true place in the world, or any kind of purpose. But that was true of almost all the drifters and scalawags who rode the rails. In the completely anonymous world of predators and prey, Watson Sr. felt like he belonged. His only waking fear was the rail yard bulls and the keen-nosed bulldogs that always accompanied them. The rail bulls were a private railroad police force were employed to deal with trouble along the lines, as well as kick freeloading drifters out of the empty freight cars, often in a way that made them unwilling to risk returning. The rail yard bulls operated by their own rules, and in the interest of their rich and powerful employers, they did not hesitate to break the law themselves. From afar, Watson Sr. had witnessed them meting out dozens of brutal beatings, as well as far more severe punishments. The bulls would not hesitate to kill a man who caused trouble on the lines. Most often, men like Watson Sr.'s, the ones who caused serious trouble, never saw the inside of a courtroom. Dangerous or repeat offenders would be beaten, lynched, sometimes tarred and feathered, and then strung up next to a remote section of track where their withered body would serve as a warning to others. Watson Sr. was very careful to not be caught, but luck was also on his side. Even for the experienced bulls, it was hard to track down a man who no one knew or had ever even spoken to. Still, that was no guarantee that he would not be caught. If they did catch him, his fate would not be much kinder than the deaths he had meted out. Keeping quietude on the lines by any means, wholesome or unwholesome, was a business suited for only a certain type of man. In many ways, Watson Sr. understood them, because they were just like him. They were the kind of men who did not mind throwing troublemakers and bindle-stiffs out of speeding boxcars into dark and dangerous woods, or off towering trestle bridges to fall in through a vanishing nothingness towards swirling rivers that ran hundreds of feet below. Since Watson Sr. understood these men, he also understood how to avoid them. In another time or in another life, he might have been one of them, rather than their quarry. Watson Sr. knew that the life he was leading could not last much longer. It was a life lived on the perilous edge of death, and the only deaths anyone ever died on the railroads were always terrible, sudden, and violent. After several years of living the life of an insatiable killer, his taste for indiscriminate murder and grotesque mutilations began to wane. He still killed, and regularly, but there was nothing new in it for him. He no longer needed to know that he could kill anyone anytime just because he wanted to do it. The empty want of vengeance had been cooled by the blood he had spilled. There was no corner of his mind left unquiet by the notion that someone might ever be able to hurt him again. Then the day came when he made a mistake. He was careful and not watchful when he should have been. One night, a night like any other, he had fallen asleep for a few hours on an empty rail car. When he awoke, it was still long before dawn. Groggy-headed, he had taken off his kerchief to wash his face with water from a canteen he had recently acquired. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss in the car, so he had not checked it before removing his handkerchief, as was his usual habit. Watson Sr. felt certain that he would have woken up if the train had slowed or stopped. He always did. He would awaken if a feather fell on the tracks, so he was shocked to his skin to see the barest movement across the car. The movement approached and resolved into the figure of a tall, wiry, but puny, dark-haired man. Without thinking, Watson Sr. grabbed for the switchblade hidden in his boot and threw it with all his might at the man. Unfortunately, Watson Sr. had no talent for throwing knives, and it not only completely missed the man's heart, it completely missed the man, and clattered uselessly into the far corner of the rail car. Alerted to danger, the man turned round quick as lightning and skittered crab-like to the corner and got hold of the knife. In that moment, Watson Sr. knew that he had picked another hunter as prey. The next things that happened so fast that they could only be seen in flashing slides of memory. The man was much smaller but also faster. He held the knife like someone who was used to holding one. An hour later, Watson Sr. kicked the man's body, deflated of all oxygen, out of the moving train to roll onto a bright yellow field, tenderly lit by the early dawn light and covered land and sky by 1,000 singing songbirds. He took a deep breath, relieved to have emerged victorious, but worried at the cost. It was not the worst beating he had ever taken, but it was the worst fight he was ever in. By sheer size and strength and a willingness to let the small knife cut where it would, Watson Sr. overcame his foe and strangled the life from his throat. But he was battered and stabbed, and he knew he had to get off the lines. There was no way to know when the train would stop long enough for him to disembark. A long and painful afternoon passed before Watson Sr. was able to safely get off the train at a hell-on-wheels camp that was set up near the tracks. Immediately he made his way to the medical tent. Since he looked like any of the other men who worked for the railroads, his appearance in the camp did not raise any eyebrows. His injuries were not seen as anything unusual and elicited no questions. Knife fights were common among those who lived life on the rails. Still, as long as he lay bandaged and helpless on a simple cot, he could not help being gripped by apprehension and worry, but it was all for naught. No one knew or cared who he was or exactly what had happened. Not a soul took a single looky-loo through the open tent flap. It was assumed that he was just another worker who had probably gotten drunk and argued with some other hobo or bindle stiff that he should not have. It was weeks before he was able to return to his hard, cold home on board the steel rail cars, and he did not return entirely unchanged. First off, he swore that he would never again throw a weapon that an enemy might claim and use against him. After his long recuperation, Watson Sr. spent many nights huddled like a moth in a cocoon against a dank, rumbling steel corner and rethought his life. He consciously decided that he no longer needed to murder every man who crossed his path. Besides, the process of dismantling a body to an empty shell was a long process, and was no longer necessary to make him feel whole. By reputation, he was the most dangerous man to ever haunt the rolling steel dungeons. Words caught up from low whispers warned him that time was running short. No matter how much time or how many miles separated his murders, the rail line enforcers were beginning to catch up to him. It had taken years, and dozens of empty bodies left broken and rotting on dirty blankets and freight cars, or simply discarded as pools of anonymous blood left with no other indication of who the man had been, how he had met his end, or at what point along the endless miles of tracks the body had been dumped. But despite all this, the railroad police were professionals, and they had begun to establish a pattern that the author of the grisly displays seemed to follow. They knew that they were looking for a large, powerful man who moved swiftly and often. Judging by his travel patterns, he kept no association with any person or place. The only descriptions they had were of a hulking figure who hid his face under an old paisley handkerchief and wore a dark greatcoat. It was not a lot. It was barely more than a description of any of the tramps, hobos, or bindle-stiffs they dealt with each day, but it was a start. Sepia-colored flyers with tattered edges began to be nailed to every available tree and power pole that bordered the tracks. The flyers gave only the barest description of the hunted man. A large, dark, heavy, great-coated features with angry black eyes glaring out over the top of a kerchief. The picture was ominous, as was the large type that announced him as the no-name killer, and offered a $10,000 reward for his capture. Watson Sr. loved his life on the rails. He loved the cold comfort of combustion, the solidity of wrought pig iron, the rumbling sound of the steel cars, the screeching of the iron brake pads, and the high, shrill call of the conductor's whistle, in a way that he would later love the salty taste of the open sea air. He did not want to give it up, and an entire army of men had been dispatched to find the killer who far and wide haunted the tracks and murdered at will. Anonymity was his only ally. He knew he must find a new life. The Hell on Wheels shanty camps, which existed in a constant state of being torn down and rebuilt, and were rank with dispossessed, nameless sorts, who would never claim any past further removed than yesterday. It was there that he could find his way off of Murderer's Mile while not totally giving up his love of trains. From his time spent in the camps, Watson Sr. knew he could slip into the ranks of hardened and faceless workers as easily as slipping into his bedroll at night. Maybe he might even become a railroad bull himself one day, he mused. After all, he was just like them in so many ways. He knew he could fit in with those men like a paisley design on a handkerchief. He understood them well, their cunning, their cruelty, their passion for the hunt, which was how he knew beyond any doubt that they were getting closer each day. It was this thought that occupied his restless mind when he jumped onto the platform of a freight car at dusk in a pouring March rain, just as he had done 1,000 times before. So that's beginning of page 40. So a couple nicks and tweaks I need to make, but overall in really good shape, and soon it will all be in this good a shape, and then I will post it on the website. But for now, that's what I've got. If this process continues to drag out, I'll do another one of these. This is pretty fun. I want to say thank you for watching. Thank you for reading my website, www.howtodealwithahaunting.com. My project is the Green Beret Barber of Orange Street, and my writer's name, of course, is E.M. Strickbine. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.